What this clip shows is really intense because on that date, just a few days away, everything will be decided for Bitcoin. Whether we see a final crash, or if massive capital flows back into Bitcoin, because right now we have a capital bottleneck. Many big investors aren't putting any money into Bitcoin because they find the situation too risky. There are just too many unknowns. I've talked about this before, that right now the uncertainty is dominating the market, for sure. And only when this uncertainty is gone, will the market decide to move back up, or quite clearly to correct downwards. And only when this uncertainty is over will the big capital flow back into Bitcoin. This clip explains exactly why. It happened here on the 2nd April. Either up or down, Donald Trump is responsible for this and the tariffs are responsible for this. But we'll watch the whole clip right now, where it explains exactly why this date is so important, what it has to do with Trump and what it has to do with the tariffs. We also look at the latest statement from Tim Draper, who believes that we are still at $250,000 upside in this cycle. He's a billionaire, and what he explains here is truly astonishing. But for now, let's take a look. Jordi Visser, who is a macro investor here, guest on the Anthony Pompliano podcast. And the episode is already close to 3 million views, so it's really taking off because he's a Donald Trump insider, talking about all the tariff issues and so on. And now he's discussing a very, very important date that could change everything for Bitcoin. I just mentioned it, depending on what happens on that date, it could either go up or it could sell off sharply. Whether that turns into a crash or just a correction, we'll have to see. You'll see that later. I mean, when I say crash, I don't mean like a 50% crash or anything, but more like maybe 10, 15% or whatever. And when I say it's going up, I don't mean there's going to be some $10,000 candle or anything like that. I mean that from this moment on, capital will start flowing back into the market more strongly, over a longer period of time. And that could be the next foundation for new highs. In any case, this isn't my assessment. It's the assessment here from Jordi Visser. Let's take a look. What the clip says is that long-term, Bitcoin is unstoppable anyway. So you really don't need to worry about that. But in the short term, there are a few important events coming up.
If he continues with this, and we have April 2nd coming up, and everyone in the hedge fund world is waiting for that, which means the opposite of de-risking is, are people going to take risk? No one's taking risk ahead of April 2nd at this point because we have no clarity on what it's going to mean. And that puts us in a very precarious position if something starts to happen. And we do have vulnerabilities on economic data, earnings, things along those lines, because the earnings period will start just after April 2nd.
This is really, really interesting, and in this half a minute, there's a ton of information packed in here. So he's saying that all the hedge funds, all the big investors, are holding back their current capital because there's way too much economic uncertainty. So we have the whole story. We don't know how inflation is going to play out, and we don't know what's going to happen with the Department of Government Efficiency. But above all, we also don't know how things are going to go with the tariffs. And here's the 2nd April, that's the important date when everything will be decided about whether this capital will flow back in. Because on the 2nd, the reciprocal tariffs will be put into effect here. These are the so-called reciprocal tariffs, and several countries will be affected by them. And so far, there have been announcements, and those announcements have always led to a sell-off in the market. Now, you could definitely say, okay, maybe it's all already priced in, and then it'll just be a nothing burger, a no event, and so on. But many people currently assume that Donald Trump is bluffing here. So that means Donald Trump is just bluffing, saying, hey, on the 12th, the tariffs will come in April, just to have some leverage to maybe reach some kind of compromise in the middle. And in fact, the interviewee is also assuming that if the tariffs actually come into effect on the 2nd of April, there will definitely be a sell-off. In fact, if the tariffs actually come into play, there could definitely be a sell-off. It could happen because a lot of people are currently expecting a bluff, since Donald Trump has done this repeatedly in the past. He said, hey, we're going to impose massive tariffs, only to then release a correction 3 hours later, where it turns out, yeah, okay, they reached some kind of compromise in the middle. So Donald Trump is definitely using these massive tariffs as leverage to maybe find some kind of middle ground and so on. And that's the big uncertainty we have. Are these tariffs really going to come in the currently planned form? Or will it come in a weakened form? And only when we are here on the 2nd, we have the go-ahead, okay, now, either the tariffs come and now nothing will change. Then there may be another downward correction. That's a good buying opportunity, and it doesn't mean that a bear market or anything like that is coming. That's just a little correction that you can take advantage of. And the second possibility would be that the market would assess this event in such a way as to say, okay, now there is clarity again, now there is security again. And this security will lead to big capital investing back into Bitcoin because, as you guys are saying, it just doesn't make sense to pump massive amounts of capital into Bitcoin as long as there's no clarity. I mean, if you look at it from a long-term perspective, it won't really matter whether you buy in at 70, 80, 85, or whatever thousand. But if you're in it for the short and medium term, then the entry prices and all that become crucial. But if you're in it for the short and medium term, then the entry prices and all that become crucial. I always say, hey, just sit back, huddle, buy Bitcoin, and take a look at it in 5 or 6 years or so, then the entry price won't bother you as much. But if you're in it for the short term, like on a 2-month, 3-month, or 6-month time horizon, then the entry prices are often way more important. The statement in the clip that we have just seen does not necessarily mean that Bitcoin will break out upwards or downwards, but rather means that until in April, everyone is just in a wait-and-see mode. Doesn't necessarily mean that it has to crash or that it will definitely break out mega upwards, but that's just how it opens up a new time window where potentially a lot of capital can flow back in, because right now we're just in a risk-off mode, where people are leaning more towards government bonds and gold. And Bitcoin tends to thrive in a risk-on environment. So whenever we have things like money printing or when there's a lot of security in the market, when we clearly know, okay, there are no unpredictable events and so on, then investors shift from their less risky investments to riskier ones. This also means in stocks that are somehow in the tech sector and so on, or in risk stocks in all sorts of speculative stuff and so on, like altcoins and whatnot. And Bitcoin is part of that too. I keep saying this. For me, Bitcoin isn't a risk-on asset. It's a risk-off asset, like a safe haven. Larry Fink sees it this way, Katie Wood sees it this way, Michael Saylor sees it this way. But for the average person, Bitcoin is still very, very risky. And when there's uncertainty, capital gets pulled back. People say, nope, I'm not buying Bitcoin right now. I'd rather get gold or bonds. And only when there's security again will all that capital shift into Bitcoin. And then Bitcoin usually manages to massively outperform the low-risk assets like gold, bonds, and so on. That means some people who trade are trading the risk-on and risk-off cycles. So when we go into risk-off mode, they pull out of Bitcoin just like the hedge fund managers described here. And when we go back into the risk-on, sentiment, what then actually happens here on the 2nd, could shift their capital back in. And the next very, very important date would be here, 6th until the 7th. That's when the next interest rate meeting. And it could potentially happen that the interest rates go down. I checked earlier, there was a survey where people basically voted on this. And there was a 100% chance that by May or June, the quantitative tightening of the Federal Reserve will stop. And then there would potentially be room to lower the interest rates, or something like that, even though it doesn't really look that way right now. But who knows, if inflation continues to decline, and if the economic data looks good, it could be that on the 6th and 7th in May. If we get another signal that everything's clear, then we could really take the next step into the risk-on sentiment. So we would take the first step here on the 2nd. April with the tariffs, which could potentially play out in a way that brings risk capital back into the market. And then in May, there's another Fed meeting that could lead to even more risk capital coming in, depending on what gets decided in that meeting. I mean, there's also a Fed meeting this week, but it's very, very likely that nothing will happen there. They won't be lowering the interest rates. Maybe Jerome Powell will say something funny about Bitcoin again. That would definitely be interesting. But now we need to take a look at Tim Draper's prediction, where he says that Bitcoin has to rise to $250,000. And he explains it all very clearly. And that's also the reason why I'm so bullish on Bitcoin. Because Tim Draper explains so well why Bitcoin is so massively superior to the US dollar. This is really a masterclass that you all need to check out.
Want a prediction? Sure, 250,000 by the end of this year. But
end of 2025.
Yeah, but what's really going on is we should really be not comparing it to the dollar anymore, because the dollar is, all fiat currencies are going to fall against Bitcoin. They continue to fall against Bitcoin. People look at Bitcoin versus the dollar, they're looking at the Bitcoin price in dollars. If you look at it slightly differently, you flip it around, Bitcoin's to the dollar, you see the dollar just falling off the map. But people aren't looking at it that way. I think you should be comparing Bitcoin to, how much, a dozen eggs or whatever it is. I think that's a better way to imagine it, because it's almost not fair to compare Bitcoin to the dollar, because if you believe, as I do, that the dollar is an antiquated currency that is not long for this world, in the next 5, 10, 50 years, that's not even a fair comparison.
Bitcoin will rise to $250,000 by the end of the year, so by the end of 2025. And now here comes the explanation. He says, and I found this really fascinating, that it's not fair to compare Bitcoin to the US dollar because the US dollar is so massively inferior to Bitcoin. And if you're going to compare Bitcoin to anything, then compare it to real assets. He's using the example of eggs, which I don't think is that great. I think a better example is if you take gold or if you take oil. Something that also has a certain price stability, that has high demand, and that also has some store of value functions. So an egg doesn't have as good of a store of value function as, say, gold. Or maybe oil, because oil lasts longer than an egg. An egg, goes bad in a few days. Or, if you don't eat it, or if you don't do anything with it, or whatever. That's why I think the approach here is very, very good, that you say, hey, comparing it to the US dollar is just complete nonsense, because, Bitcoin aims not to compare itself with the US dollar, but Bitcoin aims to compare itself with the best stores of value. If anything, Bitcoin is definitely one of the best stores of value, like oil and gold. I've explained many times why that's the case. But that's his opinion on it. That's also the reason why Bitcoin is going to benefit so massively here. And it will also rise to $250,000. Because the more the US dollar depreciates, the more Bitcoin will benefit from it. That means, what's happening right now with the Department of Government Efficiency and so on could actually lead to the dollar staying stronger. For longer than many of us think. But still, all the fiat currencies will ultimately lead to Bitcoin benefiting in the long run. Because even if the US dollar is getting a bit stronger right now, that still doesn't mean the US dollar is hard money or anything like that. That just means that the US dollar is now, say. I'm saying that the US dollar is less sick right now or that it has less weakness, but the US dollar is still going to be a weak currency. The US dollar is still going to be a sick currency, and it's still going to be a corrupt currency. And the only way out of this corruption, out of this sickness, is Bitcoin. Tim Draper has recognized this, and that's why he's so hyper-bullish on Bitcoin. But many people just don't look at Bitcoin as fundamentally as Tim Draper. On the other hand, a lot of people just look at the macroeconomic events happening in the short term, like with the tariffs and all that. That's why they pull back their capital and only invest it again when the uncertainty is gone. Tim Draper sees it long term. He's probably putting money in all the time. Putting in cash, I could see that, like Michael Saylor or something. And now the question is, what are you going to do? Do you see this in the short term? Are you concerned here because everyone is starting to panic about the tariffs? Or do you see it the same way in the long run as Tim Draper or Michael Saylor, who just say, hey, the fundamentals are so strong that nothing can really break down on a 5-year, 10-year, or even 100-year basis? If you're definitely bullish on Bitcoin right now, I'll put a link down below for you. 21 Bitcoin, how you can easily, safely, and simply buy Bitcoin. Here, you can get up to 20% off the fees when buying Bitcoin with the code BitcoinHotel. This is an absolute recommendation. Super simple to use for beginners, pros, and advanced users. Make sure to check it out. And if you want to store your Bitcoin in the best way possible, I'll put a link down below to a TREZOR hardware wallet. Here, you can easily manage your Bitcoin in the safest way to manage your Bitcoin, protected from hackers, theft, and other issues, while maintaining full self-sovereignty. And if you want to buy a TREZOR, you can use the code BitcoinHotel, all lowercase, to get a 10% discount when purchasing one of these hardware wallets. Absolutely recommended. Guys, I'm signing off. See you later. Peace out.